When you picture a classical Greek hero, the image is almost always the same. You see the divine strength of Heracles or the unbeatable, spear-wielding brawn of Achilles. Odysseus completely breaks that mold. He possesses no supernatural physical superiority. Instead, his primary weapon sits right between his ears. In fact, when the Greek kings called on him to fight in the Trojan War, he didn't charge eagerly into battle. He tried to dodge the draft. To avoid leaving his family, he feigned complete insanity, hitching an ox and an ass together and attempting to plow his own fields with salt. The ruse failed, and he was dragged to the front lines. But that exact same deceptive instinct is what eventually ended a brutal 10-year stalemate at Troy. The Greek army couldn't breach the city walls with brute force, and decades of traditional warfare had achieved nothing. The siege finally broke because Odysseus engineered a masterpiece of psychological infiltration. By conceiving the Trojan Horse, he convinced a paranoid enemy to willingly drag a hostile strike team right through their own impenetrable gates. Ancient artists understood this distinction perfectly. If you look at this classical marble bust, you rarely see the focus placed on bulging muscles. They gave him a thick beard and the conical pylos hat of a weary traveler or sailor, explicitly marking him as a tactician and a thinker. This forces an uncomfortable question. We celebrate his intellect, but examining the massive trail of bodies he leaves behind, we have to ask, are we studying a brilliant genius worthy of emulation, or a manipulative survivor who weaponized his own mind to destroy everything in his path? The encounter with the Cyclops Polyphemus reveals the jarring split in Odysseus's character. Trapped in a cave where his men are being eaten alive, he orchestrates a flawless escape. He gets the giant drunk, blinds him with a sharpened stake, and claims his name is Nobody, ensuring that when the monster cries out for help, the other Cyclopes ignore his screams. To get past the blinded, thrashing giant blocking the exit, Odysseus ties his surviving men to the bellies of the flock's sheep. When Polyphemus lets the animals out to graze, the crew slips out completely undetected. But surviving isn't enough for him. His ego demands recognition. As his crew frantically rows their ship to safety, his pride overrides his intelligence. He cannot stomach the thought of remaining an anonymous victor. Standing at the prow of his escaping ship, he screams his true name back at the shore, wanting Polyphemus to know exactly who bested him. Armed with that name, the Cyclops immediately invokes a targeted, devastating curse from his father, Poseidon, god of the sea. That single moment of arrogance shatters their triumph. The tactical brilliance saved their lives for a day, but that unearned hubris bought his crew a full decade of violent storms, shipwrecks, and ultimately, death. As the journey drags on, the quick-thinking leader hardens into a cold-blooded pragmatist. The clearest example occurs when the surviving crew must navigate a narrow strait flanked by two lethal threats, a ship-swallowing whirlpool named Charybdis, and Scylla, a monster boasting 6 heads. There is no mathematical way through the strait without casualties. Forced to choose, Odysseus makes a calculated decision to steer the ship away from the whirlpool and directly into Scylla's striking range. He knows the monster will snatch exactly 6 sailors, but the ship itself will survive. He makes this calculation in absolute silence. He issues no warnings. He lets his men row right into the jaws of the beast, deliberately offering 6 of his own sailors as unwitting bait, while the rest of the crew rows frantically to safety. The utilitarian math secures the survival of the mission, but the moral cost crosses a terrifying line. He stops acting like a noble protector guiding his men home and starts operating like a ruthless general, spending lives on a ledger to guarantee his own return. After 20 punishing years, Odysseus finally reaches the shores of Ithaca. Disguised as an elderly beggar, he infiltrates his own palace to find it overrun by 108 aggressive suitors harassing his wife, Penelope. He bides his time until she sets a challenge, stringing his impossibly stiff hunting bow. It is a test of dexterity that only he can pass. Faster, more urgent, true. The moment his arrow flies true, the trap springs. He abandons the beggar disguise and immediately orders his son to lock the doors of the great hall. He traps the 108 suitors inside, transforming the royal court into a slaughterhouse. Look at the depictions on this ancient Greek pottery. The era normalized fierce retribution, but Odysseus takes it to an extreme. The violence doesn't end in the hall. He turns his attention to the palace servants, forcing the unfaithful maids to clean the blood of the suitors from the floors before having them all hung outside. When the dust finally settles on Homer's epic, the triumphant hero is completely indistinguishable from a blood-drenched warlord. He resecures his kingdom not with restorative justice, but with a terrifying display of absolute, merciless force. Even with his throne secure, the blood follows him. The blind prophet Tiresias had warned that his journey wasn't over. Years later, he dies in a twist of tragic irony, killed in a beach skirmish by a young man arriving on the shores of Ithaca. That young man was Telegonos, his own unrecognized son born of the sorceress Circe. By the 1970s, as a generation of soldiers returned from the Vietnam War, a new interpretive lens emerged. Scholars began to look past the heroic tropes and instead saw a man defined by 20 years of nonstop adrenaline, exhaustion, and survivor's guilt. This shift focuses on specific symptoms, his chronic paranoia, and his tendency to interpret every stranger as a lethal threat, and his uncontrollable weeping when hearing stories of the war. These traits suggest that the suitor massacre wasn't an act of justice, but a hyper-vigilant survival response typical of someone who can no longer distinguish a palace from a battlefield. Authors like Margaret Atwood have pushed this deconstruction even further. In works like The Penelopiad, feminist critiques strip away the charming rogue persona entirely. They expose a manipulative, controlling villain who engineers the narrative to justify his own cruelty toward women and subordinates. This continuous reinterpretation is exactly why Odysseus still commands our attention. He is the Western world's prototype for the modern anti-hero, a deeply flawed human whose intellect could conquer monsters and empires, but whose pride and trauma were just as destructive.